The neighbours mocked the cabin's second roof, until the extreme heat arrived. Margaret Harrison had always been known in the small Pine Valley for her stubbornness. At 72, her face marked by time and hands calloused from hard work, she was raising her 2-year-old grandson Mikey alone, after her daughter Jennifer had to move to Chicago in search of work. It was on a Tuesday morning that the neighbours began to notice something strange. Margaret was in the yard of her modest wooden cabin, measuring planks and making notes on a yellowed piece of paper. At first, they thought she was fixing the roof, which indeed needed some repairs. But when Mr. Arthur, the closest neighbour, offered to help, she did something she had never done in decades of friendship. "Thank you, Arthur, but this time I need to do it myself," she said, without even looking up from the paper. Arthur stood there, not understanding. Margaret always accepted his help. When her husband William was still alive, the three of them worked together on every project on the property. Now, for the first time, she was refusing. "But Margaret, these planks are too heavy for you, and Mikey is running around here. He could get hurt." "He won't get hurt, no, I'll take care of him. And the planks, well, I'll manage." The conversation ended there, but Arthur left intrigued. He had known Margaret for over 40 years, and knew when she was determined to do something. She had that fixed gaze, the same expression she made when she decided to plant corn at a time when everyone said it wouldn't work, or when she insisted on raising chickens even without experience. In the following days, Margaret began working on the construction. It wasn't a normal roof repair. She was literally building a second roof on top of the first one. The structure began to take shape when she set 4 wooden posts, one at each corner of the cabin, extending them about 2 meters above the original roof. "What kind of madness is this?" commented Mrs. Eleanor, the neighbor across the road, watching from her window. "She must be trying to build a shed on top of the house," replied her husband, Mr. Howard, "but it makes no sense at all." The speculation spread quickly through the small rural community. Pine Valley had just over 200 people, and any novelty became a topic of conversation for weeks. Margaret's strange construction would be no different. Mikey, oblivious to the adults' criticism, played happily around the construction site. The big-eyed blonde boy followed his grandmother's every move, sometimes trying to help by carrying small pieces of wood or handing her nails. Margaret would always stop what she was doing to pay attention to her grandson, explaining what she was doing in language the boy could understand. "Grandma's making a new little house for us, Mikey. It's going to be nice and cool." "Cool?" asked the boy, not fully understanding. "Yes, my love. Nice and cool and comfy." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. As the days passed and the structure of the second roof became more evident, the criticism became more direct. During Sunday Mass, after the service, some ladies from the community gathered at the door of the small wooden church to discuss the matter. "Someone needs to talk to her," said Mrs. Gladys, a 68-year-old lady who always considered herself the informal leader of the village women. "Margaret is wasting money on something that makes no sense. Worse than that, it could be dangerous," added Mrs. Eleanor. "What if it collapses? With that child playing around there?" "I already tried to talk," said Arthur, who was listening to the conversation from a distance. "She won't hear any of it. She's more stubborn than a mule." Arthur's words hurt more than he imagined. Margaret was passing in front of the church at that moment, returning from the bakery with Mikey in her arms and a bag of bread. She heard the comment and felt her chest tighten. Arthur had always been her closest friend, especially since William passed away 5 years ago. If even he was talking like that. "Let's go, Mikey," she murmured, quickening her pace. "Is Grandma sad?" asked the boy, noticing the change in his grandmother's expression. "No, my angel. Grandma is just thinking." That night, after putting Mikey to sleep, Margaret sat on the porch of the cabin and looked at the half-finished structure. The beams of the second roof stood out against the starry sky, creating a strange silhouette that really did seem to have no purpose. For the first time since she started the project, she allowed herself to doubt. Was she doing the right thing? The money she was spending was all she had saved over the last few years. Without William's pension, she relied only on her small income and the little bit Jennifer sent when she could. If this didn't work out. But then she remembered the notebook. The notebook of notes that William left, full of observations about the weather, the seasons, the patterns of rain and sun he had recorded for decades. She had read those pages so many times, she practically knew them by heart. "The heat is changing," he had written in one of the last entries, shortly before he passed. "It's not like what I knew in my youth. It's getting more intense, longer. One day a heat will come that ordinary houses won't be able to handle." At the time, Margaret thought they were just the reflections of a man feeling the weight of his years. William had always been observant, but those words had a different tone, as if he was truly worried about something. Now, years later, seeing the changes she herself had noticed, longer summers, higher temperatures, less rain, his words made more and more sense, and that's why she had decided to build the second roof. The following Monday, Margaret resumed construction with renewed determination. She no longer cared about the curious looks from the neighbors when they passed by on the dirt road in front of her property. She also didn't mind the whispers she knew were happening behind her back. The work was truly heavy for a woman her age, carrying the planks, climbing the ladder to position the beams, hammering the nails. Everything required an effort that left her back aching and her hands full of blisters. But she persisted, stopping only to care for Mikey and for meals. It was during one of these lunch breaks that Jennifer appeared. Her 35-year-old daughter had managed to get a few days off from her job in Chicago and decided to visit her mother and son. When she arrived and saw the construction, she was speechless. "Mum, what is this?" Margaret was feeding Mikey, who got excited when he saw his mother arrive. "Mommy!" shouted the boy, trying to get out of the high chair. "Hi, my love." Jennifer picked up her son and gave him a big kiss, but her eyes remained fixed on the strange structure above the cabin. "Mum, I asked what this is." "A second roof." "I can see it's a second roof. The question is why." Margaret sighed and got up from the table. She knew this conversation was coming sooner or later. Jennifer had always been practical, objective, one of those people who needs to understand the logic behind every decision. Because it will be necessary. Necessary for what? "Mum, you're spending all your savings on something that has no purpose. The neighbors are saying you're getting kind of crazy." Margaret finished the sentence with a bitter smile. "Is that what they're saying?" Jennifer lowered her eyes. That was exactly what they were saying, and she knew her mother knew. "It's not exactly like that, Mom. It's just nobody understands." "I don't understand either. Explain to me what you're thinking." Margaret looked at her grandson, who had returned to his little chair and was playing with some small pieces of wood she had given him. The boy stacked and knocked over the pieces, laughing each time they scattered across the table. "Do you remember your father, Jennifer? How observant he was." "Of course I remember. He left some notes about the weather. He noticed things were changing." Jennifer sighed impatiently. She loved her father, but she always thought he had certain fixations that led to nothing practical. "Mum, Dad took notes about everything. The color of the clouds, the way the little birds flew, the time the flowers bloomed. That doesn't mean that—" "Yes, it does," Margaret interrupted firmly. "Your father understood nature, and he knew a time would come when ordinary houses wouldn't be able to handle the heat." "What heat, Mom? What is this all about?" "Jennifer, you live in the big city. You have air conditioning, you have electric fans, you have all those things. Here we have none of that. When a truly strong heat arrives, houses like ours will turn into ovens." Jennifer looked around the simple cabin. Indeed, her mother's house was very basic. Wooden walls, clay tile roof, a few small windows. In the summer, the place got stuffy, but it had never been unbearable. "Mom, even if that's true, even if it's going to get terribly hot, why a second roof?" "Because it creates an airspace between the two. The air circulates, it doesn't get as hot inside." Jennifer pondered the explanation. It made a certain sense in a simple way, but still. "Are you sure this will work? And if it doesn't? You'll have spent all your savings for nothing." "If it doesn't work, so be it. But if it works and I haven't done it, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The conversation was interrupted when Mikey knocked all the pieces of wood onto the floor and started to cry. Margaret got up to comfort him, leaving Jennifer thoughtful. Her daughter spent the rest of the afternoon observing the construction, trying to understand the logic behind it. When night fell, Jennifer decided to stay a few more days to help. Even though she didn't completely agree with the project, at least she could make sure her mother didn't get hurt trying to do everything alone. "All right, Mom, I'll help, but promise me one thing." "What?" "If the money runs out and you can't finish, we stop right there. You won't go into debt over this." Margaret agreed, relieved to have at least her daughter's support, even if partial. In the following days, mother and daughter worked together on the construction. Jennifer was younger and stronger, so she could carry the heavier pieces, while Margaret was responsible for the measurements and placing the smaller pieces. Mikey continued playing nearby, now with 2 women to watch him. Working as a pair sped up the progress, but it also made the neighbors' criticisms more intense. Now it wasn't just Margaret doing a crazy thing, it was Margaret convincing her daughter to join the crazy thing too. "Poor Jennifer," commented Mrs. Gladys during the weekly market in the village's central square. "Working all week in the city, comes here to rest, and her mother puts her to work on something senseless. Margaret has always been stubborn, but now she's going too far," added Mr. Howard. "And on top of that, she's influencing her daughter." The criticisms reached Jennifer's ears one afternoon when she went to the bakery to buy bread. Mrs. Eleanor couldn't contain herself and commented directly to her. "Jennifer, dear, don't you think it's time someone had a serious talk with your mother? This construction makes no sense at all." "Why doesn't it make sense?" Jennifer replied, surprised by the direct approach. "Well, my dear, a second roof for what? No one's ever seen that around here, and your mother is spending money she doesn't have on something that won't be any use." "Are you sure it won't be good for anything?" Mrs. Eleanor seemed disconcerted by the question. She expected Jennifer to agree and maybe even ask for help convincing her mother to stop. "Well, of course I'm sure. What use could it have?" "I don't know," Jennifer answered honestly. "But my mother isn't crazy. If she's doing it, she must have a reason." The unexpected defense from her daughter took Mrs. Eleanor by surprise. Jennifer paid for the bread and left the bakery, leaving the woman even more curious about Margaret's project. That night, Jennifer talked to her mother about the encounter at the bakery. "Mum, the neighbors are really bothered by this construction." "I know. Doesn't it matter to you?" Margaret stopped combing Mikey's hair and looked at her daughter. "Jennifer, I've lived through a lot in this life. I've seen people criticize choices that ended up working out, and I've seen people praise decisions that were disastrous. In the end, I'm the one who will bear the consequences. If I'm right, great. If I'm wrong, that's my problem. But you've always gotten along well with the neighbors. Don't you want to lose those friendships?" "A friendship lost over a construction isn't a real friendship, Jennifer." Her mother's answer made Jennifer reflect. Really, if the people in the community changed their attitude toward Margaret because of a project that didn't directly affect them, perhaps those relationships weren't as solid as they seemed. The next morning, the 2 women resumed work. They were close to finishing the main structure of the second roof. Jennifer had to return to Chicago at the end of the week, so they pushed themselves to make as much progress as possible. It was during this time that the first incident that truly shook Margaret happened. Mikey was playing in the backyard as usual when he tripped on a board that had come a bit loose near the construction site. The boy fell and hit his knee on a rock, making a small cut that bled a lot. It was nothing serious, but the child's crying frightened both women. Margaret and Jennifer ran to help him, washed the wound and put on a bandage. Within minutes, Mikey was playing again as if nothing had happened, but the incident was seen by Mrs. Eleanor, who was passing by on the road at that exact moment. In the afternoon, Jennifer received an unexpected phone call. "Jennifer, this is the health clinic. We received a report that there's a child in a risky situation at your home." "What do you mean?" "Someone reported that your son got hurt today due to dangerous construction. We need to make a visit to assess the conditions." Jennifer was outraged. It was obvious someone had exaggerated the incident to try to harm Margaret. "Look, my son did get hurt, but it was a small scratch. He tripped and fell, something that happens to any child. It has nothing to do with the construction." "Even so, we need to verify its protocol." The visit happened the next day. The clinic nurse, Nurse Catherine, had known Margaret for years and only did a quick formal check. She confirmed the child was fine, the house was clean and organized, and there was no real risky situation. But the episode deeply affected Margaret. For the first time, someone had officially questioned her ability to care for her grandson. The idea that they might try to take Mikey away from her terrified her. "Jennifer, you need to take Mikey with you," said Margaret that night, her eyes watery. "What do you mean, Mum?" "If they think it's not safe for him here, he's better off staying with you in the city." Jennifer was shocked. She knew how much Mikey meant to her mother, especially after William left. The boy had become Margaret's reason for living. "Mum, no one is going to take Mikey from you. It was just a routine check. Nurse Catherine herself said nothing was wrong." "But what if they come back? If anyone insists this isn't a safe place for a child?" Jennifer hugged her mother, sensing all the vulnerability she was trying to hide. "Mum, listen. I'm not taking Mikey. He's happy here. You take such good care of him. And if anyone tries anything, I'll come right away, okay?" Margaret nodded, but Jennifer could see the veiled threat had shaken her deeply. On Friday, Jennifer had to return to work. The structure of the second roof was almost ready. Only the shingles on the new roof and some finishing touches were left. Margaret would be able to finish it alone in the coming weeks. "Mom, call me for anything. Any problem, I'll come running." "You can go in peace, daughter. I can handle it." Jennifer left, but with a heavy heart. She had the feeling she was leaving her mother in a difficult situation, facing the community's criticism and pressures alone. In the days that followed, Margaret resumed the solitary work. Without Jennifer's help, progress was slower, but she persisted. With each shingle placed, each nail hammered, she felt she was getting closer to completing something important. Arthur passed by the property a few times, clearly wanting to approach and offer help, but not knowing how to address Margaret after the comments he'd made at church. Their decades-long friendship was strained, and both felt the weight of that distance. It was Mikey who broke the ice. One afternoon, the boy was playing in the yard when he saw Arthur passing by on the road. With the spontaneity of children, he ran to the fence and shouted, "Uncle Arthur! Uncle Arthur!" Arthur stopped and smiled at the boy. Since he was little, Mikey had called him uncle even though they weren't related. "Hi, Mikey, how are you, kiddo?" "Grandma is making a new house." "I can see that. It's looking nice." Margaret, who was on the roof placing shingles, heard the conversation and was torn between climbing down to greet her friend or continuing to work. She chose to continue, but with her heart racing. "Uncle Arthur, come see," Mikey insisted. Arthur looked in Margaret's direction, who pretended to be focused on her work. "Another time, Mikey. Uncle's in a hurry right now." But before leaving, he shouted toward the roof, "Margaret, if you need anything, just call." Margaret stopped what she was doing and looked at him. For a moment, they stared at each other from a distance. She gave a slight wave, and he returned the gesture before continuing on his way. That small moment of reconciliation gave Margaret new energy. Perhaps not everything was lost between her and the neighbors. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing, the second roof was completed on a Monday morning. Margaret placed the last shingle and climbed down the ladder with a mixed feeling of relief and satisfaction. It had taken almost 2 months to complete the project, working alone most of the time, but it was finally done. The structure really created a strange look for the small cabin. The double roof considerably increased the building's height, making it stand out from the other houses in the neighborhood. Between the two roofs, there was a space of about 20 inches, supported by wooden pillars at the 4 corners. At first glance, it seemed to have no function, but Margaret knew exactly what she had created. Mikey, who had watched the whole construction, was thrilled with his grandma's new house. He ran around the yard, pointing at the roof and shouting, "Done! New house done!" Margaret smiled and picked up her grandson. "Yes, my love. Now we'll have a nice, cool house to live in." That first night after the work was completed, Margaret noticed a subtle difference in the cabin's internal temperature. The atmosphere seemed a bit more airy, though the difference was minimal. The real test would come in the next few months, when summer arrived in full force. The community's criticism, however, intensified with the project's completion. Now that everyone could see the final result, opinions became even harsher. "It looks like a giant chicken coop," commented Mr. Howard during a conversation at the grocery store. "Or a madhouse," added Mrs. Gladys with malice. "Poor Margaret. I think after William passed she was never the same," said another neighbor, feigning pity. The comments reached Margaret's ears through third parties, and each one was like a small stab. She had expected some resistance, but hadn't imagined it would be so cruel. The situation got even worse when the parish priest, Father Thomas, decided to address the subject during a Sunday sermon. "Sometimes, my brothers and sisters, wisdom lies in accepting our condition and not trying to change what God has established," he said, looking directly at Margaret in the small congregation. "There is beauty in simplicity, in the humility of accepting our situation without trying to be different from others." Margaret felt her face flush with shame. It was clear the priest was referring to her construction. Several people in the church turned to look at her, some with pity, others with curiosity. After Mass, Margaret quickly left the church, carrying Mikey in her arms. She didn't want to give anyone a chance to come talk to her about the sermon. "Is Grammy mad?" asked Mikey on the way back home. "No, my angel. Grammy is just thinking." But Margaret was doing more than thinking. She was deeply questioning whether she had done the right thing. Spending all her savings on a construction nobody understood, alienating neighbors she had known for decades, being the target of gossip and criticism. Was all this worth it? That night, she opened William's notebook again. She leafed through the yellowed pages, reading the detailed observations her husband had made over so many years. Average temperatures for each month, dry periods, rainfall indexes, animal behavior during different seasons. A specific page caught her attention. It was one of the last entries, made just a few months before William's passing. January 2018, 106 degrees in the shade. Never seen that before. The chickens were panting all day. The house became unbearable even with all the windows open. Margaret got sick from the heat twice. This isn't normal. Something is changing. Margaret remembered that January. It had been truly terrible. They had spent several nights sleeping on the porch because the inside of the cabin was unbearable. If it weren't for the night breeze coming from the pines. She leafed through a few more pages and found another worrying note. March 2019. Summer that won't end. It should be cooling down by now, but it's still hot like January. The little birds are disappearing. I think they're looking for cooler places. I'm afraid of what's coming. And on one of the last pages, written in the already shaky handwriting of his illness, "Margaret, if you ever read this, remember what I always said about observing nature. It never lies. The heat is changing, and houses like ours won't be able to handle it. Think of a solution, my love. Think of Mikey." Margaret closed the notebook with tears in her eyes. William had foreseen all of this. He knew she would be criticized. He knew it would be difficult, but he still left that advice. The next morning, a news report on the radio caught Margaret's attention. The meteorologist was talking about the forecast for the coming summer. "Temperatures are expected to be higher than the historical average. We recommend the population prepare for a period of intense heat, especially in rural regions where there is no cooling infrastructure." Margaret turned off the radio and looked at the double roof of her cabin. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. William was right. She was right. Soon everyone would see. The months passed slowly. Autumn arrived later than normal, and when it finally cooled down, the temperature difference was small. Winter was short and mild, almost non-existent. In September, when spring had barely begun, the temperatures were already high. Margaret followed everything with growing attention. The weather forecasts became increasingly alarming. Words like historic heat wave and record temperatures became common on the news. Jennifer called frequently, worried about the news reaching Chicago. "Mom, they're saying it's going to be terribly hot there in the countryside. Are you sure you don't want to come spend a few days here at my place? I have air conditioning." "No need, dear. It's fine here." But Mom, if it becomes unbearable, you call me, okay? I'll come get you and Mikey right away. All right, Jennifer. Don't worry. But Margaret was not worried. In fact, she was eager to see if all the months of work, all the criticism she had faced, all the money she had spent, if all of that would finally make sense. The first sign came in October. A mass of hot air from the north caused temperatures to rise quickly to 100 degrees. In most houses in the valley, the heat became suffocating. People began to complain, to look for shade, to drink more water. In Margaret's cabin, the indoor temperature was noticeably milder than in other houses. The space between the two roofs created an air circulation that kept the environment cooler. It wasn't a dramatic difference, but it was noticeable. Mikey played normally inside the house, while other children in the neighborhood were irritable and sweaty. Margaret cooked without excessive discomfort, while Mrs. Eleanor commented that her kitchen was unbearable. But that was just the beginning. In November, a new heat wave hit the region. This time, thermometers reached 107 degrees for 3 consecutive days. The heat index came close to 120 degrees. It was something no one in the valley had experienced before. The consequences were immediate. Several people fell ill during the day. The health clinic received cases of dehydration and heat stroke. The children became listless and irritable. The elderly suffered especially. Mrs. Gladys, who lived in a brick house that heated up like an oven, spent 2 nights unable to sleep. Mr. Howard had to be taken to the health clinic with symptoms of heat exhaustion. Arthur, whose house was close to Margaret's, commented to his wife, "It seems like Margaret's house is cooler than ours." "How so?" "I passed by there yesterday. You could see through the window that Mikey was playing normally inside, while here we can barely move." Arthur's wife, Mrs. Dorothy, became curious. The next afternoon, when the heat was impossible, she decided to visit Margaret under the pretext of asking about a recipe. "Margaret, are you home?" "Yes, Dorothy. Come in." When Mrs. Dorothy entered the cabin, she was surprised. The environment really was cooler than her own house. It wasn't cold, but it was bearable. "My goodness, Margaret, how is it cooler here?" Margaret smiled. It was the first time someone acknowledged the difference. "It's the second roof, Dorothy. It creates an air circulation that makes the house less hot." Mrs. Dorothy looked up, trying to understand how that worked. "Really? And how did you know this would work?" "My husband studied these things. He left some notes." The two women talked for over an hour, while Mikey played happily on the living room floor. Mrs. Dorothy noticed that the child was not sweaty or irritable like the other children she had seen in those days. When she left Margaret's house and returned to her own overheated home, Mrs. Dorothy was certain Margaret wasn't crazy. Margaret was right. That night, Mrs. Dorothy told Arthur about the visit. "Arthur, you need to see this. Margaret's house really is cooler. That second roof really works." "Really?" "Really. And I was ashamed thinking about how we criticized her. Margaret knew what she was doing." Arthur grew thoughtful. He had known Margaret for decades and always knew she wasn't one to make decisions without reason. Perhaps he should have trusted his friend's good sense from the start. The next morning he decided to make peace. He walked to Margaret's property and knocked on the door. "Margaret, may I come in?" "Of course, Arthur. Come in." As soon as he entered the cabin, Arthur felt the temperature difference. It was remarkable. "Margaret, I came to apologize." "Apologize for what?" "For doubting you, for saying those things at church. I should have trusted your judgment." Margaret was moved. The reconciliation with her closest friend meant a lot to her. "You don't need to apologize, Arthur. Everyone has a right to their opinion. But I shouldn't have spoken that way. You've always been sensible. You've always had a reason for the things you do. I should have asked before criticizing." The two talked at length, recovering the intimacy of their old friendship. Arthur was especially impressed when Margaret showed him William's notebook. William really was observant. I never thought he would have foreseen something like this. He knew the climate was changing, and he knew we needed to adapt. When Arthur left Margaret's house, he was convinced she had done the right thing. And more than that, he was worried about his own family. If the heat continued like that, they would need a solution too. The news of the effectiveness of Margaret's second roof began to spread discreetly through the community. Mrs. Dorothy told a few friends, Arthur mentioned it to other neighbors, and gradually people began to pay attention to Margaret's different house. Some still resisted admitting they had been wrong. Mrs. Gladys, especially, insisted it was just an impression, and that the difference couldn't be that great. But in December, when the real test came, no one could deny the reality any longer. The most intense heat wave ever recorded in the region hit Pine Valley on December 15th. Thermometers read 113 degrees in the shade, with a heat index of 126 degrees. The heat was unbearable, suffocating, dangerous. The traditional houses of the valley turned into ovens. Even with all the windows open, the indoor temperature reached close to 104 degrees. People couldn't cook, couldn't sleep, could barely move. The health clinic was overwhelmed with heat-related cases. Children with fevers, elderly people dehydrated, adults with symptoms of heat stroke. Nurse Catherine had never seen anything like it. The electrical power began to fail due to the overload from fans and appliances trying to ease the heat. Without power, the situation became even more desperate. That's when the first call for help happened. Mr. Stanley, a neighbor who lived a few houses down from Margaret's property, appeared at her cabin door with his 5-year-old grandson in his arms. The child was clearly suffering from the heat, panting, and with very red skin. "Margaret, for God's sake, can you let the boy rest a bit in your house? Ours is unbearable and he's feeling sick." Margaret opened the door immediately. "Come in, Stanley, of course you can." When Mr. Stanley entered the cabin with his grandson, the difference was shocking. The indoor temperature was at least 15 degrees lower than in his house. The environment was cool, breathable, comfortable. "My God in heaven," murmured Mr. Stanley. "How is this possible?" "It's the second roof," explained Margaret simply. "Let the boy rest here as long as he needs." Within minutes, the child was visibly better. His breathing normalized, his skin returned to its normal color. The boy even asked for water and a cookie. Mr. Stanley stayed at Margaret's house for 2 hours, impressed by the effectiveness of the solution everyone had ridiculed. "Margaret, I have to apologize. We mocked you, criticized you, said it was crazy, but you knew what you were doing. You saved your grandson, and you might still save others. No need to apologize, Stanley. What matters is that the boy is okay." When Mr. Stanley left Margaret's house and returned to his own overheated home, the news of the cool refuge spread quickly through the valley. By late afternoon, other neighbors began to appear. First, Mrs. Eleanor, who was desperate because her 85-year-old mother wasn't feeling well in the heat. "Margaret, could you let my mother rest here a bit? She's feeling very poorly." "Of course, Eleanor. Bring her in." The elderly woman was brought in a wheelchair and placed in Margaret's living room. Within half an hour, she was visibly better and even managed to drink some iced tea. Soon after, Mrs. Gladys arrived with 2 young grandchildren. Even she, who had been one of the fiercest critics, had no choice but to swallow her pride. "Margaret, I know I said some unpleasant things about your construction, but do you think you could? The boys are suffering so much in this heat." Margaret welcomed everyone without showing any resentment. Her small house became full of neighbors, children, elderly people, all seeking relief from the unbearable heat. Mikey was thrilled with so many visitors. For him, it was like a big party at his grandmother's house. He played with the other children, shared his toys, helped Margaret serve water to everyone. At night, when the heat finally gave a small respite, people began to return to their homes. But before leaving, everyone made sure to thank and apologize to Margaret. "Margaret, you saved my family today," said Mr. Stanley with teary eyes. "Margaret, I will never forget this. You opened your home to us after everything we said," said Mrs. Eleanor. "Margaret, you are a wise woman. We should have listened to you from the start," even Mrs. Gladys said. Margaret just smiled and said there was no need to thank her. But inside, she felt a deep satisfaction. Not an "I told you so" satisfaction, but a satisfaction from having done the right thing, from having managed to help when it was necessary. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. now continuing. In the days that followed, the extreme heat continued. Margaret's house became an unofficial refuge for the community. People came and went during the day, especially the elderly and children who couldn't bear the heat in their own homes. Margaret's routine changed completely. She woke up early to prepare cold water and juices for visitors, organized spaces so everyone could sit comfortably, and made sure no one went without. Jennifer called worried when she heard on the news that the region was facing record temperatures. "Mom, how are you doing there? They're saying on the news it's unbearable." "We're fine here, dear. The house is cool." "Cool, but how?" "They're saying it's 113 degrees. "It is, but in here it's about 99, 100. It's quite bearable." "Mom, you were right. The second roof worked." "Yes, it worked." "And the neighbors, how are they reacting?" Margaret looked around the living room, where at that moment 3 children were playing on the floor. 2 elderly ladies were resting in chairs, and Mr. Stanley was drinking cold water in the kitchen. "The neighbors are here at home with me." Jennifer was surprised. She knew about the criticism her mother had faced. "What do you mean, Mom?" "They came to ask for help. The heat in their houses is unbearable, so I opened our home to anyone who needs it." Jennifer felt a wave of pride for her mother. Even after being criticized and humiliated, Margaret was helping those who had looked down on her. "Mom, you're amazing. Are you sure you don't need anything? I can send money, food, anything." "There's no need, dear. Everyone is pitching in. Everyone brings something, water, food, whatever they can. Everyone is helping each other." And they really were. The extreme situation had united the community in a way no one expected. People who normally barely spoke were sharing the same space, looking after each other, collaborating so everyone could get through the crisis. Arthur became a sort of informal organizer. He created a schedule so Margaret's house wouldn't get overcrowded, ensuring everyone had a chance to rest in the cooler environment. He also organized a contribution system. Each family brought something to share. Mrs. Dorothy took charge of caring for the younger children, telling stories and organizing quiet games so everyone could rest. Mr. Stanley, who had first aid experience, kept an eye out for signs of heat stroke and dehydration in the most vulnerable. Even Mrs. Gladys, finally swallowing her pride, offered to help in the kitchen, preparing juices and iced tea for everyone. The most remarkable transformation happened with Father Thomas. The priest, who had indirectly criticized Margaret during his sermon, showed up at her house on the 3rd day of extreme heat. "Margaret, can I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course, Father." The two stepped out onto the porch where, even with the outside heat, the shade from the second roof created a more bearable environment. "Margaret, I've come to ask for forgiveness." "Forgiveness for what, Father?" "For what I said in church, about accepting our condition, about not trying to be different from others. I was wrong." Margaret was surprised. She hadn't expected this kind of conversation with the priest. "You weren't trying to be different out of vanity or pride," Father Thomas continued. "You were preparing to help. And when the time of need came, you opened your home to everyone, without exception. That is what Christ would do." "Father, I just did what I thought I should do. And that is exactly what made your gesture so special. You did what needed to be done, even when no one understood, even when you were criticized." Father Thomas paused and looked inside the house, where children played and adults rested in peace. "Margaret, you've taught me an important lesson about faith. Sometimes faith isn't about passively accepting our condition. Sometimes faith is having the courage to act when we see something needs to be done, even when no one understands." The conversation deeply moved Margaret. Having the recognition from the priest, who represented the community's moral authority, meant a great deal. The following Sunday, Father Thomas made sure to mention Margaret during his sermon. "My brothers and sisters, in these days of extreme heat, we've had a valuable lesson in our community. We've learned that sometimes wisdom comes disguised as foolishness, and that sometimes those we criticize the most are the ones who have the most to teach us." He looked directly at Margaret in the congregation, who blushed with emotion. "Mrs. Harrison has shown us that true wisdom is not only preparing for difficulties, but also being ready to help when those difficulties arrive. She has taught us about generosity, about forgiveness, and about how to turn criticism into opportunities to serve. After Mass, several people approached Margaret to greet her and thank her again for the help during the days of extreme heat. The heat wave lasted a full week. During this period, Margaret's house functioned as a true community centre. People came and went, always finding a welcoming and cooler environment. The children, especially, benefited enormously. While in other houses they became irritable, apathetic, and even sick from the heat, at Margaret's house they could play, eat properly, and sleep adequately. Mikey became the group's mascot. All the older children looked after him as if he were a little brother, and he loved all that attention. Margaret was moved seeing her grandson interact with so many different people, learning about coexistence and solidarity. A particularly touching situation happened on the 5th day of the heat wave. Mrs. Hazel, a 78-year-old widow who lived alone at the end of the street, fell ill at home and was brought to Margaret's house in critical condition. The elderly woman was dehydrated, with high blood pressure and clear signs of heat stroke. Nurse Catherine from the local clinic was called and said that Mrs. Hazel needed to be taken to a hospital in Chicago, but there was no transportation available at that moment due to the extreme heat. "Let's take care of her right here," decided Margaret. "Here she'll stay cool and we can give her all the attention she needs." During the next 48 hours, the community came together to care for Mrs. Hazel. Margaret gave up her own bed so the elderly woman could be more comfortable. Mrs. Dorothy was responsible for giving medication at the right times. Arthur installed a fan powered by a car battery to create an additional breeze. Mr. Stanley monitored her vital signs. Gradually, Mrs. Hazel recovered. The lower temperature in Margaret's house, combined with the community's constant care, saved the elderly woman's life. When she finally sat up in bed and asked for a glass of water, everyone celebrated as if it were a collective victory. "Margaret," said Mrs. Hazel in a still, weak voice, "you saved me. All of you saved me." "We only did what any neighbor would do," replied Margaret. "No, you did much more than that. You treated me like family." That moment marked a definitive transformation in the community. People realized they had created something special there, a network of support and mutual care that went far beyond criticism and superficial differences. When the heat wave finally passed and temperatures returned to more bearable levels, people began returning to their homes, but something had changed forever. The first change was in how the neighbors saw Margaret. She had gone from the crazy lady with the second roof to the wise woman who saved us. Respect and admiration were evident in every conversation, in every greeting on the street. The second change was in the community's cohesion. The people who had shared difficult days in Margaret's house continued to help each other afterward. Neighbors who barely spoke before now stopped to chat. Children who didn't know each other had become friends. Arthur was the first to make a practical decision based on the experience. "Margaret, I want to build a second roof on my house too. Can you teach me how to do it?" "Of course, Arthur. It's simpler than it looks. And how much did it cost? Because if it works so well, it's money well spent." Margaret did the math and showed him the expenses she had incurred. Arthur was surprised. The cost wasn't as high as he had imagined, especially considering the demonstrated benefits. "Margaret, if you don't mind, I'd like to organize a community workday. Several families here could benefit from a second roof, and working together makes it cheaper and faster." The idea of the community workday excited Margaret. The prospect of seeing her solution adopted by others, of knowing more people would be protected from extreme heat, filled her with satisfaction. "That would be wonderful, Arthur. I'll help with whatever is needed." In the following weeks, Arthur organized meetings to plan the collective project. Several families expressed interest in building second roofs on their houses, some because they had directly experienced the benefits at Margaret's house, others as a precaution after seeing how extreme heat could be dangerous. Mr. Stanley, who worked in construction, offered his technical knowledge. Father Thomas suggested the church buy materials in bulk to get better prices. Mrs. Gladys, completely transformed by the experience, volunteered to coordinate the financial part of the project. Margaret became the unofficial technical consultant. She taught everyone the basic principles, the ideal height between the roofs, how to create openings for air circulation, what type of wood to use, how to calculate the amount of material needed. The collective project became an event that mobilized all of Pine Valley. Families who had never worked together united to build. Children helped by carrying nails and tools. Elderly people offered advice based on decades of experience. Jennifer came from Chicago to participate in the community effort. She wanted to see firsthand how the community had transformed around her mother's idea. "Mom, I'm impressed. Everyone here speaks of you with such affection, such respect." "It's because we went through a difficult situation together, dear. That brings people closer." "But it's not just that. You had a vision that no one else had. You prepared, and when the time came, you were ready to help everyone." Jennifer looked around, seeing neighbors working together to build a second roof on Mr. Stanley's house. "You changed this community, Mom, and changed it for the better." The community effort lasted several weeks. Every weekend, a new family had their second roof installed. Margaret oversaw each construction, offering suggestions and ensuring everything was done correctly. During this period, something unexpected happened. A journalist from Chicago learned of the story through Jennifer, who had mentioned at work the transformation of the rural community. The reporter, Brian Foster, arrived in Pine Valley on a Thursday morning, interested in doing a story about creative solutions for heat waves. "Mrs. Harrison, may I speak with you about your construction?" Margaret became nervous. She had never spoken to a journalist before. "I don't know what interesting things I can tell you." "You can tell me how you got the idea to build a second roof and how it helped during the heat wave." The interview lasted 2 hours. Brian Foster was fascinated not only by the technical solution, but by the human story behind it. The initial criticism, Margaret's persistence, the community's transformation, all of it was part of a powerful narrative. "Mrs. Harrison, do you have any idea how inspiring your story is?" "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just did what I thought should be done." "But that's exactly what makes it all so special. You didn't do this to show off or to prove something. You did it because you believed it was necessary." Brian Foster spent 3 days in the village, interviewing several residents and documenting the process of building the new double roofs. Everyone spoke of Margaret with admiration and gratitude. The story was published in a nationally circulated magazine under the title "The Wisdom of the Second Roof: How an Elderly Woman Transformed Her Community with a Simple and Brilliant Solution." The impact was much greater than anyone expected. The magazine received hundreds of letters from readers interested in the technique. Television programs requested interviews. Universities asked for technical information about the construction. Margaret was completely bewildered by all that attention. "I don't understand why so many people are interested in this," she commented to Jennifer during one of the many calls she started receiving. "Mom, because in a world full of complicated problems, you showed that sometimes the solution can be simple. And because you showed that you act out of love, not for recognition." The external attention brought unexpected benefits to Pine Valley. A construction materials company offered a special discount for residents who wanted to build second roofs. A university sent engineering students to study the technique and suggest improvements. Most importantly, the regional city council decided to include the double roof technique in the public housing program, officially recognizing its effectiveness. But for Margaret, the most important recognition remained that of her neighbors. Seeing the families in the community protected from the heat, seeing the unity that had been created, seeing Mikey growing up in an environment of cooperation and solidarity, that was worth more than all the external fame. During the following summer, when new heat waves arrived, the difference was noticeable. Several houses in the valley now had double roofs, and those that didn't knew they could seek shelter in those that did. Margaret's house continued to be a reference point, but now it wasn't the only option. The community had collectively prepared to face the extreme heat. On a particularly hot afternoon, Margaret was sitting on the porch watching Mikey play in the yard, when Arthur appeared for a visit. "Margaret, do you know that today marks exactly 1 year since you finished your second roof?" "Does it really? Time has flown by." "And do you know how many houses in the valley have a second roof now?" "I haven't counted." 23, almost half the houses in the community. Margaret smiled, satisfied. Seeing her idea adopted by so many families filled her with joy. "And you know what else?" Arthur continued. "The folks in the neighboring valley, St. Jude, have also started building second roofs. The idea is spreading." "That's good. The more people protected from the heat, the better. Margaret, you've changed a lot of people's lives, not just here in our valley, but in other places too." "I didn't change anything, Arthur. It was a need that changed everything. I just prepared for it." Arthur laughed at his friend's modesty. "Margaret, you're impossible. You've always been too modest." "It's not modesty, it's that I know I didn't invent anything. I just paid attention to my husband's teachings and acted when it was necessary." At that moment, Mikey interrupted the adults' conversation. "Grandma, can I go play with my friends at Uncle Arthur's house?" "Yes, you can, my love." The boy, now 3 years old, had become a sociable child beloved by the entire community. He moved freely between the neighbors' houses, always received with affection. "Arthur," Margaret said after Mikey ran off, "thank you." "Thank you for what?" "For being my friend again. For forgiving me when I refused your help at the start of the construction." "Margaret, I'm the one who should apologize for doubting you, for speaking ill behind your back. We've already talked about that. It's all forgiven. Even so, I wanted you to know I learned an important lesson. I learned not to judge people by appearances, not to criticize what I don't understand." Margaret nodded, moved. The reconciliation with Arthur had been one of the most important aspects of that whole experience. "And I learned that sometimes it's worth insisting on an idea even when everyone thinks it's crazy," she said. "If I had given up at the first criticism, we would have had a very hard time during that heat wave." The two friends fell silent for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun was setting, creating a golden light that highlighted the silhouette of the second roof on Margaret's cabin. "Margaret, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Do you miss Mr. William?" Margaret smiled with a melancholy expression. "Every day, Arthur. Every day. But you know what moves me the most? Knowing that he would be proud to see how his notes helped so many people. He always said knowledge is only worth something when it's shared. And that's exactly what you did. You took the knowledge he left and shared it with the whole community. And look at the result. We have a community that's more united, more prepared, more caring. William would be moved to see this." When Arthur left, Margaret was alone on the porch, watching the movement in the valley. Children played in the street, adults chatted in their doorways, the elderly rested in the shade of the second roofs. It was a scene of harmony and tranquility that contrasted sharply with the tension and division that had characterized the community a year before. Margaret thought about all the changes that had happened. The initial criticism that almost made her give up, the lonely construction under the scorching sun, the doubts about doing the right thing, the arrival of the extreme heat wave, the transformation of the house into a community refuge, the reconciliation with the neighbors, the recognition of the wisdom behind the madness. Each phase of that process had been important. The criticism had strengthened her. The lonely work had tested her determination. The arrival of the extreme heat had validated her predictions, and the need to help had revealed the true value of community. Jennifer called that night, as she had regularly since the heat wave the previous year. "Hi, Mom. How was your day?" "Quiet, honey." Arthur stopped by. "We talked about how things have changed this year." "Mom, I have some news to tell you." "What news?" "Remember I said I was going to try for a transfer to the countryside, to be closer to you?" "I remember, and I got it. I'm coming back to the region next month. I got a job in the neighboring town, half an hour from your house." Margaret was moved. Having her daughter nearby again would be wonderful, especially now that the community had become such a welcoming place. "What joy, Jennifer. Mikey is going to be over the moon with happiness." "Me too, Mom. Especially after seeing how you turned that place into a real home." "I didn't turn anything, honey. It was necessity that brought us together." "Mom, you're still being too modest. But that's okay. I'm used to it." After the call, Margaret got ready for bed. She checked if Mikey was properly covered, turned off the house lights and lay down in bed. Before sleeping, She always looked at the ceiling and thought of William. That night was no different. "William, my love," she thought, "your notes saved a lot of people. The prediction you made came true, but we were prepared. And more than that, we came together to face it as one. You would be proud to see how our community has transformed." She fell asleep with a smile on her face, knowing she had played her part well in the story William had begun to write so many years before. The next morning, Margaret woke up with Mikey climbing onto the bed to say good morning. "Good morning, Grandma. Mommy is coming back." "Yes, she is, my love." "Isn't that great? Is she going to live with us?" "She's going to live nearby. We can see her every day." Mikey was thrilled with the news. He missed his mother, even though he was very attached to his grandmother. During breakfast, Mrs. Dorothy appeared at the door with some news. "Margaret, can you come outside for a minute?" Margaret went out and found a small crowd gathered in front of her house. They were neighbors, acquaintances, people she had helped during the heat wave. "What's all this, everyone?" Arthur stepped forward carrying a wooden plaque. "Margaret, we got together and decided to pay tribute. With your permission, we'd like to place this plaque here in front of your house." Margaret looked at the plaque and was moved. It read, "Home of Mrs. Margaret, the sage of the second roof, first house with a double roof in Pine Valley, community refuge during the 2025 heat wave." "Oh, folks, there's no need for this." "Yes, there is," interrupted Mr. Stanley. "You made history here in our valley. Future generations need to know this story. It's so when your grandchildren grow up, they'll know what kind of grandmother they had," added Mrs. Gladys. "And so when outsiders come, they'll understand this place is special because of you," finished Father Thomas. Margaret was so emotional she could barely speak. Seeing those people, who a year earlier had criticized her, now paying a sincere tribute, was more than she ever could have imagined. "If you all think it should be this way," she managed to say finally. The plaque was installed in a small ceremony. Mikey helped Arthur screw the plaque onto the post in front of the house, while everyone applauded. When the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, Margaret stood observing the plaque. It wasn't vanity. She truly felt she didn't deserve so much recognition, but she understood that it represented something bigger than herself. It represented a community's ability to transform, to learn from mistakes, to unite in hardship. A few weeks later, when Jennifer returned to the area for good, she was amazed by the changes she found. "Mom, this place is unrecognizable." "How so?" "Everyone I meet speaks of you with such affection, such respect, and look how many houses have a second roof now." It was true. Walking through the valley, one could see dozens of houses with the modification Margaret had started. Each adapted to the specific conditions of the building, but all following the basic principle of the double roof. "And there's more," continued Jennifer. "The city council put up a sign at the entrance to the valley. Pine Valley, land of the double roof, first rural community adapted for climate change in the region." Margaret laughed at the news. "Now they've gone too far." "They haven't gone too far at all, Mom. You started a movement that's spreading throughout the region. People are coming from far away just to see how it works." That was also true. In recent months, Margaret had received several visits from people interested in learning about the double roof technique. Students, engineers, city council representatives, all wanted to understand how such a simple solution could be so effective. Margaret always received everyone with humility, patiently explaining the basic principles and giving credit to William's notes. She never tired of repeating that she hadn't invented anything, just applied old knowledge to a new situation. One day, a university professor came to visit her with an unusual proposal. "Mrs. Margaret, I'd like to invite you to give a lecture at the university." "A lecture about what?" "About your experience with the double roof, about how a community can adapt to climate change, about community leadership." Margaret was taken aback. "Professor, I don't understand any of those things you mentioned. I just did some construction on my house." "Mrs. Margaret, you did much more than that. You showed that effective solutions can be simple, that it's possible to prepare for future problems, and that one person really can make a difference in a community." Margaret thought about the proposal for a few days. The idea of speaking to university students intimidated her, but if her experience could help other people— "All right," she said finally. But I'll speak in my own way, with my simple words. That's exactly how we want it, Mrs. Margaret. The lecture happened on a Thursday afternoon. Margaret was nervous, but Jennifer accompanied her for moral support. The room was packed. Students, teachers, researchers, all curious to hear the story of the wise woman of the second roof. Margaret began by talking about William and his weather notes. She explained how she had interpreted those observations and decided to build the second roof. She described the criticism she faced and how she almost gave up several times, but the part that most moved the audience was when she told them about the heat wave and how her house became a refuge for the community. "The most important thing wasn't having the right idea," said Margaret. "The most important thing was opening my home when people needed it, because a structure is only worth something if it serves to help." At the end of the lecture, Margaret received a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Many people asked technical questions, others asked about social aspects of the experience. An architecture student asked a question that especially struck Margaret. "Mrs. Harrison, what would you say to people who have an idea they believe is good but are being criticized for it?" Margaret thought for a moment before answering. "I would say 3 things. First, make sure your idea can truly help someone. It's not just for show. Second, be prepared to work alone if necessary, but never lose hope that people will understand. Third, when the time comes for your idea to be useful, be ready to share it without charge, without resentment." The answer was met with warm applause. After the lecture, several people approached to speak personally with Margaret. She was surprised by the genuine interest she sparked. A young engineer said, "Mrs. Harrison, you inspired me to look at my work differently. Sometimes we get so focused on complicated solutions that we forget the simple ones can be more effective." A sociology professor commented, "Your experience is a perfect example of how social change can start with courageous individual actions." Margaret went home that day with a strange feeling. On one hand, she was happy to know her story could inspire others. On the other, she still found it hard to believe she had done something so special. She talked about this with Jennifer during dinner. "Mom, you need to understand that you did do something very special. Not because of the roof itself, but because of the attitude." "What attitude?" "The attitude of believing in an idea even when everyone doubted it, of working hard to make that idea a reality, and of using the result to help others." "Anyone would do that." "No, Mom. Unfortunately not. Many people give up at the first criticism. Many people who manage to realize a good idea use it to promote themselves, not to help. You are different." Margaret became thoughtful. Perhaps Jennifer was right. Perhaps her attitude really was different from most people's. That night, before sleeping, she reflected on the entire journey. From the day she decided to build the second roof to that moment, speaking to university students about her experience. "Funny how life changes," she thought. "A year ago, I was the crazy lady of the valley. Today, I'm the wise woman giving lectures at the university. But deep down, I'm the same person. I just did what I thought should be done." And perhaps that was exactly what made Margaret special, her ability to remain true to her own principles, regardless of external criticism or praise. In the months that followed, life in Pine Valley continued peacefully, but with a different quality than the previous tranquility. It was a peace based on mutual trust, on the certainty that the community would know how to come together when necessary. Margaret resumed her normal routine of taking care of Mikey, maintaining the house, and helping the neighbors when they needed it. The only difference was that she now received visitors regularly, people interested in learning about the double roof technique or hearing her story. She always welcomed everyone kindly, but never let the fame change her simple and warm personality. One day, a special surprise arrived in the mail. It was an official letter from the regional city hall announcing that Margaret had been chosen as Citizen of the Year for her contribution to the climate adaptation of the rural community. The award ceremony would be held in the big city, with authorities and press in attendance. Margaret was torn between honor and embarrassment. "Jennifer, I don't know if I want to go to this ceremony." "Why not, Mom?" "There will be many important people, a lot of formality. I don't feel comfortable in that kind of situation." "Mom, you deserve this recognition. and it could be an opportunity to talk about the importance of rural communities. After much thought, Margaret decided to accept the invitation. On the day of the ceremony, she wore her best outfit, a blue dress that Jennifer had bought for the occasion, and headed to the big city accompanied by her daughter and grandson. The event was indeed formal, with authorities giving speeches about sustainability and climate adaptation. Margaret felt out of place for most of the ceremony, but when it was her turn to speak, something changed. Looking at the audience, she saw curious and attentive faces, people genuinely interested in her story. "I don't know how to make pretty speeches," Margaret began, "but I can tell you how a simple idea changed my community." She spoke for 15 minutes, telling her story in a simple and straightforward way. She talked about William and his notes, about the criticism she faced, about the heat wave that validated her predictions, about how necessity united the community. "What I learned is that sometimes the best solutions are the simplest," Margaret concluded, "and that an ordinary person can indeed make a difference as long as they are willing to work and share." The speech was met with a warm ovation. Several people from the audience approached her afterward to congratulate her personally. The regional mayor, who had presented the award, commented, "Mrs. Harrison, you've given us an important lesson about leadership. You showed that leading isn't about giving orders. It's about setting an example." On the way back home, Margaret reflected on the mayor's words. She had never thought of herself as a leader, but perhaps there were different types of leadership. "Mum," Jennifer said during the trip, "do you realize the impact you have on people?" "What impact?" "You inspire people to believe in their own ideas, to not give up when they're criticized. That's very powerful." Margaret looked out the car window, watching the rural landscape pass by. On some properties, she could identify houses with second roofs, evidence of how her idea had spread. "If I inspire people, it's because they already have within them the desire to do something good," she finally said. "I just show them it's possible." Back in Pine Valley, Margaret was greeted with a small surprise party. The neighbors had organized to celebrate the award she had received. The party took place in the village's central square, under an improvised tent that protected from the sun. Several families contributed food and drink. There was music, children playing, an atmosphere of genuine celebration. During the party, Margaret had the chance to talk individually with many neighbors, recall the difficult moments they had been through together, and celebrate the positive changes in the community. Mr. Stanley, who had become one of the most enthusiastic advocates of the double roof technique, made a toast. "Margaret not only saved us from the heat, she taught us to be a real community. Before, we were just neighbors. Now, we're family." The toast was met with applause and joyful squeals from the children. Later, when the party was winding down and people began to disperse, Arthur approached Margaret. "Margaret, can I ask you one more personal question?" "Of course. Do you regret anything? Facing so much criticism, spending your savings, all the work you had?" Margaret looked around the square, where happy families were cleaning up the remnants of the party, children were running between the tables, and elderly couples chatted quietly. "No, Arthur, I don't regret a thing. It was all worth it." "Even when it seemed like everyone was against you?" "Even then. Because I knew I was doing the right thing, even if no one understood it at the time." "And how did you have that certainty?" Margaret thought about the question for a moment. "Because I wasn't doing it to impress anyone or to gain something. I was doing it because I thought it was necessary. When we act out of love, not self-interest, we always have certainty." Arthur nodded, understanding the depth of her answer. When everyone had left and Margaret returned home with Jennifer and Mikey, she sat back down on the porch to contemplate the end of the day. The sun was setting behind the eucalyptus trees, creating the same golden light that had always enchanted her. But now there was something different about the landscape. Several houses in the valley had second roofs, creating a unique silhouette against the sky. "Mum," said Jennifer, sitting beside her, "do you want to know something?" "What?" "I'm proud to be your daughter." "Why, dear?" "Because you taught me it's worth fighting for our convictions, even when it's hard. You taught me the most important thing isn't being right, it's being willing to help." Margaret smiled and hugged her daughter. And you taught me it's worth persisting, even when it seems like no one understands. You gave me strength when I needed it most." Mikey, who was playing in the yard, ran over to the two women. "Grandma, tell the roof story." It was a request he made often. Margaret always told the story adapted for his age, emphasizing the importance of helping others and never giving up on dreams. "Once upon a time there was a grandma who had an idea," began Margaret, picking up her grandson. "Everyone said it was a silly idea, but she believed in it anyway." As she told the story, Margaret looked at the houses in the valley, where families would sleep peacefully knowing they were protected from the extreme heat, where neighbors helped each other, and where differences had been overcome by common need. The story she told Mikey was more than a bedtime tale. It was a lesson about courage, persistence, and love for others. It was a legacy she hoped her grandson would carry into adulthood. When Mikey fell asleep in his grandmother's arms, Jennifer took him to his crib. Then she returned to the porch where Margaret continued to contemplate the approaching night. "Mum, can I ask you a question?" "Of course." "If you could go back in time, would you do anything differently?" Margaret thought about the question for a long moment. "Maybe I would try to explain my idea better from the start. Maybe people would have understood more quickly and wouldn't have had to go through the extreme heat to realize the need." "But would they have believed it without seeing the result in practice?" "Probably not," Margaret admitted. "Sometimes people only learn when they experience it for themselves." "Then maybe it was better this way after all." People learned, the community came together, and everyone came out of the experience stronger. Margaret nodded. Jennifer was right. If everything had been easy from the beginning, perhaps the community wouldn't have gone through the profound transformation it had experienced. The criticism, as painful as it was at the time, had made the final victory more meaningful. The solitary work had tested her determination. The need to help during the crisis had revealed each person's true character. "You know what makes me happiest?" said Margaret. "What?" "Knowing that this won't stop here. The people who learn to build second roofs will teach others. The communities that heard our story will prepare better for the future. Mikey will grow up knowing the importance of helping others." "It's true, Mum. You started something that will continue for a long time." Margaret smiled, satisfied with this prospect. Her simple construction had become something much larger, a symbol of how one person can make a difference, how communities can adapt and grow stronger, how loving your neighbor is always the best motivation. That night before sleeping, Margaret had her usual conversation with William. "My love," she thought, "your wisdom not only protected us from the heat, it taught us about community, about friendship, about forgiveness. Your notes turned into a life lesson for all of us." She fell asleep with the certainty that she had fulfilled her mission. Not just the mission of building a roof, but the greater mission of turning an idea into practical love, criticism into opportunities, division into unity. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of hammers and saws coming from the neighbor's house. She looked out the window and saw that the Silver family, newly arrived in the valley, was starting the construction of their second roof. She smiled. Life went on. People kept learning and preparing for the future. Her story had become part of the community's story, and the community had become an example for others. Margaret put on a simple dress, prepared breakfast for Mikey and Jennifer, and got ready for another ordinary day in her extraordinarily simple life. Because in the end, true greatness wasn't in having revolutionized construction techniques or having received awards. True greatness was in having turned love into action, knowledge into service, and division into unity. And that was something Margaret did every day without fanfare, without seeking recognition, simply because she believed it was the right thing to do. End of story. This was a fictional story created to touch our hearts. Now tell us what you thought. Do you believe Margaret made the right decisions? What would you do in a similar situation? Leave your opinion in the comments with sincere words. We look forward to reading your point of view. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories.